Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you might be joining us. Welcome to the latest and greatest installment of the Richard Watkins Podcast. I am your humble host, Dr. Richard Watkins. I'm super excited to be with you today, whether you are a night owl or a morning bird. Thank you for being here with us. The Richard Watkins Podcast is a proud production of the Science Policy Action Network, your go to source for top tier research and analysis, consulting, and if you need some support with engagement, check out the Science Policy Action Network at span-inc.org. That is span-inc.org. Now, with that out of the way, let's get right into it today because we've got a really exciting episode, jam packed. It's going to be really, really great. I recently heard, and if you're a fan of sports like I am, you are not surprised that gambling in the gambling industry is one of the fastest growing sectors of our current economy. Now, this might be news to a lot of folks, but again, if you are a fan of sports, this should come as no surprise. Now, we saw this coming from a mile away. Many of us did. It first started out with fantasy football, right? I know everybody was involved with fantasy football. I am a huge football fan. I had the honor and privilege of playing football in college. And so I watch football all the time. All of my friends watch football as well. I used to love going to the barbershop, not even necessarily to get a haircut, but to argue about sports. It was one of my favorite things to do. And so sports is a huge thing. But I remember when fantasy football really came online, and fantasy football isn't the only type of fantasy sport, but for some reason in my circles, in my orbit, it felt like one of the fastest things going on. And so many of my friends were like, Richard, join my league and, join my conference or join the draft. I don't really know how fantasy football works, but they were asking me things that sounded like that. And I would always say, no, I don't like it. I don't like gambling. And they're like, it's not gambling. It's like fantasy sports. It's not the same as gambling. And I'm not trying to say that I'm a prude or anything. I just don't like gambling. It's like not my thing. It takes away from, the experience of being a spectator, at least just for me. Right. So I'm not a prude. I don't have any reason to judge someone whether or not they gamble or not. It's on them. It's just not something that I like to do. I know a lot of people like to gamble. It's absolutely fine. But I started to think, you're sitting here watching the game, waiting for a player to do something very specific or to have stats that look a certain way. So you're not just looking for the outcome of the game. You're not just looking for your team to win. You're looking for specific outcomes, performances of players on teams that are not even your favorite team. So I noticed that people were watching and looking at football as a sport, that to me at the time felt a little bit like gambling, kind of. And so I felt that, okay, this is like gambling. People are participating in it. And then once I started seeing monetary awards associated with performance in fantasy leagues and fantasy sports and fantasy football, I was like, okay, this seems like it's getting close to gambling. Um, and sure enough, we ended up with a lot of gambling in sports. And if you've watched sports commentary, your favorite sports shows, or even an actual sporting event like a football game or even a basketball game, baseball game, whatever, you'll quickly start noticing a a lot of commercials about gambling, right? Gamble with this, gamble with that. Your number one gambling source. You even watch commentary now, and they're telling you how they think you should bet. And there's a lot of conversations about spreads and overs and unders and so on and so forth, right? There is so much about it. And it has become very, very clear that, gambling had moved from kind of obscurity, right? Kind of in the periphery to now front and center, where some of your top sponsors of your favorite programs are uh, betting services. Your commercials are commercials on behalf of betting services. And that's really just starts highlighting, how significant gambling has become. Now, that has also increased the conversations on whether or not gambling is even, considered to be a good thing or not, because whether it's for reasons associated with religious observances or reasons associated with kind of collective senses of morality, many people are starting to ask questions about, gambling and whether or not it is the right thing to do. And now you can pretty much gamble on anything. It doesn't have to be a sporting event. You can gamble on entertainment. You can gamble on politics. If the outcome of something is debatable, right, then it can be gambled upon. And so that has created a lot of conversations. A lot of people questioning, gambling as in regards to, health, not just morality, right? What are people actually dealing with? And I think it's important to really kind of appreciate that. Now, gambling oftentimes falls into a category of mental health that is referred to as behavioral addiction. Not all gambling, but some gambling is referred to into the category of behavioral addiction. And the information that I am pulling from when I give you a definition of behavioral addiction is from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Briefly, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is an authoritative classification and diagnostic reference published by the American Psychiatric Association for mental disorders. So this is, even though it's called a manual, this is a manual that is authoritative. So industries and fields related to mental health, they will go to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, in order to determine what mental disorder that an individual is grappling with. And so, what I am reading is the authority on mental disorders. Now, it's not the only thing to go off of, but it is put together by the American Psychiatric Association, association revered here in the United States in regards to psychology, psychiatry, and mental health as the authority. Now, we're going to get into this as you have probably picked up on several of the differences between the definitions of psychology and mental health are not clear. And so, take a lot of, these arbitrary classifications with a grain of salt, because language, as we'll talk about on another subject on this episode, oftentimes is not clear. There are no specific definitions that everyone agrees upon. However, I will point out that one of the big differences between psychology and psychiatry is the inclusion of medicines or pharmacological approaches. So, your psychiatrists are physicians or MDs that also engage with mental health. So that is a huge difference between psychiatry and psychology, is that psychiatry includes the use of pharmacological approaches and the prescription of drugs to utilize to uh, deal with uh, your mental health circumstances, whatever they may be. So again, going back to the DSM for folks who don't know, right? So if you hear these words, there is an authority that you can go to get a better understanding of what you're hearing and what you're going to be dealing with. So I encourage everybody to check it out. You can easily look it up. The DSM has been used for a very, very long time. So what it provides, the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it provides a standardized diagnostic criteria for mental disorders. And that is really, really important. It means that um, someone who is practicing um, uh, psychology or psychiatry or providing mental health services in one place, they're speaking the same language or they're approaching it the exact same way as someone in another place, which is very, very important. And the lack of that creates gaps quite often. So having this authoritative manual is very, very important because it creates consistency. And consistency in approaches is really important. It doesn't mean that things cannot be improved, right? The DSM has had many iterations, meaning that it has been revised and updated and will be continued to be revised and updated as new information becomes available. But it is important to have that. It also creates common terminology. One of the things that I'm going to start really focusing on is how terminology in general is inconsistent. And what also is inconsistent is working definitions regarding the words that we take for granted and the words that we use all the time. We're going to talk a little bit about that today, and we'll have future episodes where we dive into that a little bit more. But common terminology for clinicians, researchers, educators, insurers, that is a huge piece. And then also courts, right? So these mental health disorders, they have implications in insurance, and they also have implications in your court system as well. Again, when talking about mental health, there are words that are only used in a legal setting that are not used in a clinical or a health setting in regards to mental health, and that's really important because you might hear something in regards to something in a legal setting, and it may not have any relationship to anything medical at all or anything coming from the field. It's a term, and it's a word used to describe something that only exists in the legal setting or the courtroom setting, and that's really, really important to appreciate as well. And like I said, we'll perhaps have somebody to come in and talk about that specifically because I think that is so important. And a lot of people, I know myself, didn't really know it until, I scratched the surface and dug a little bit deeper. And it also guidelines to ensure consistency and reliability in diagnosis across different settings, right? Again, I just want to stress consistency. It's so important that we are using the same language. It's so important that when using terms, that we adhere to the definitions and we work diligently to make sure that those terms are used appropriately, because when they are, fields and providers are able to provide improved care. And for people who are receiving those services, that's very, very important. It changes the quality of their life. Oftentimes, longevity is impacted by it. And so it's just really important that we have these in place and that they exist. So people are talking about mental health, and that is important. And for you to understand that they are pulling from a common source of information, and that source is the DSM. Now, going back to gambling, gambling disorder is part of a classification in the DSM 5 referred to as behavioral addiction, right? So, behavioral addiction, really quick, one second. Get you a definition of behavioral addiction here, really quick. See what it says. Please define behavioral addiction as defined by the DSM. Let's see what it says for behavioral addiction. Now, this is interesting. Now, the DSM-5 does not recognize behavioral addiction as a general diagnostic category. Instead, it classifies gambling disorder as the only formally recognized behavioral addiction within the category substance-related and addictive disorders. From the DSM perspective, a behavioral addiction is therefore defined functionally as a persistent and recurrent engagement in a behavior that leads to clinically significant impairment or distress and is categorized by impaired control over the behavior, compulsive participation, continued involvement despite negative consequences, and features analogous to substance or disorders such as craving, tolerance, and withdrawal like symptoms. And so, if you are participating in gambling to the extent that you cannot help it, that when you don't gamble, you feel as though something is missing, right? You don't feel yourself, right? These withdrawal like symptoms, or you're craving the opportunity to gamble, right? And it prevents you from doing, other things that you would normally like to do. And then, according to this, you'd be classified as having an addictive disorder, right? That is a behavioral addiction, and that is gambling. So now let's really try to dive into how people are looking at addiction, because what we have just explored here is a connection between gambling and substance abuse. Now, when we were first approaching the conversation about gambling, we were talking about how it is now in the forefront and how it historically was in the periphery of mainstream. And it was done so because people looked at it negatively. Now, the reason perhaps that it was looked at negatively is that it is very similar to what we see when people are grappling with a substance use disorder. And that's again described as in the DSM. Now, very briefly, if you're interested in substance abuse or substance use disorder, and I just want to use the terms correctly here, uh, substance use disorder is a problematic pattern, right? That's really, really important. A lot of these definitions have a threshold where partaking in it a little bit is considered okay. I know that's a subjective term, but then you cross a threshold and then it is considered to be a problem. So, is a problematic pattern, keyword problematic, of substance use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress, as manifested by at least two of the following 11 criteria occurring within a 12-month period. So the DSM, in order to create consistent criteria, lays out the criteria for people wherever they are to look at them and to then to determine what criteria is manifested so that that person that is being services are being rendered to falls into the correct category. And these are the criteria for substance use disorder. Number one, the substance is taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than intended. Number two, persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control use. Number three, a great deal of time spent obtaining, using, or recovering from the substance. Number four, craving or strong desire to use the substance. Number five, recurrent use resulting in failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. Number six, continued use despite persistent social or interpersonal problems caused or worsened by use, right? So if your use of the substance is causing stress in your relationships, whether they're your romantic relationships, casual relationships, and it's caused by your use of the substance or is worsened by your use of the substance, right? So, despite that, you're still using that substance. Seven, important social, occupational, or recreational activities are given up or reduced. So if you were somebody who liked going to the gym, if you were somebody who was part of a book club or going to church, and you started pulling back from that to make more time to to use the substance, and that is what that is talking about, especially if it's important, right? So that's the key thing, important. Recurrent use in situations where it is physically hazardous. So perhaps it's an addiction to alcohol and you continue to consume it despite the fact that you have to drive. So that's a hazardous situation and you continuously do it. Continued use despite knowledge of having a physical or psychological problem caused or exacerbated by the substance. So the substance is making you sick, right? The substance is giving you a hangover. The substance is creating a persistent cough or uh, you know, breathing respiratory issues, or the substance is causing psychological harm, right? Anxiety might be worsened, or it could impact depression or something like that. That is what that's talking about. So if it's caused or exacerbated by the use of the substance. Tolerance. Tolerance is a huge one, right? And it's defined by you being able to consume larger and larger amounts of the substance, um, because the previous amount is no longer having the same effect on you. And so you're able to do more and more and more of it. For example, you could be an individual who consumes one beer, and after consumption of one beer, you may feel inebriated, intoxicated, you may feel drunk. And then after frequent use over a period of time, you go from feeling drunk after drinking just one beer to now you're able to drink a six pack of beer without feeling drunk at all. So that's that tolerance piece. You're able to tolerate the consumption of increasing amounts of that substance. Um, yeah, I mean, it's as simple as that. So that tolerance piece is really big. And lastly, withdrawal, right? Um, is characteristic by withdrawal symptoms or used to avoid withdrawal. So, Maybe you don't feel like you're yourself. Maybe you might feel nauseous. Maybe you might feel anxious, maybe restless, or have the inability to fall asleep when you don't use that substance. And so you continue to use it out of fear of not, right, out of fear of not feeling yourself, or right, you have to use it to do all of that stuff. So it's, feeling withdrawal symptoms or used to avoid feeling these withdrawals. So, you know, again, you have increasing levels of severity when you're talking about addiction or when you're talking about substance use disorders. So you've got mild 2 to 3 of those criteria, moderate 4 to 5 of those criteria, or severe 6 or more of that criteria. Now, it's important to keep in mind that all of these are impacted by what is considered to be socially acceptable, right? Because so many of these things here are defined in context of social interactions or responsibilities that you have, right? Whether it's work, school, or home, your relationships with, folks. And it's kind of subjective, like, is this important or will this affect you? It depends greatly on your social circles and what those social circles are used to doing, right? But it's really important to kind of really understand that, you know, many people would fall into this category. Um, Maybe they are able to have a day-to-day life where falling into these categories don't really impair them. But if they looked at it, they would realize that, oh, I do fall into several of these categories. So it's just really important to realize how easy or how simple it is to fall into one of these categories. It hinges upon the fact that an individual experiences something that they enjoy and they want to continue to do it. And the pursuit of that enjoyment sometimes interferes with what they're supposed to be doing or who they have been known to be. And that's also a really, really important part to really understand about, substance use disorders is that the consumption of the substances is enjoyable, and that individual enjoys that feeling that it gives them, and so they repeat it, and that's a normal human behavior. The reason why we put it in here is because we need people to behave a certain way to have a functioning society. And a functioning society depends on contributing members of that society agreeing to behave and act a certain way. There's nothing specifically, like, objectively you shouldn't do this, but subjectively we've agreed on as a society this is how we should be and this is how we should act, and we put things in place, right? But a person finding something that is enjoyable and then repeating that activity or the consumption of that substance that brings them enjoyment, that's a normal human experience. And it's not only just human. Um, it seems to be the case that in the natural world, that is just how things go. There are several examples of this, right? You've got you've got your resorts and tropical locations that are frequented by monkeys who then steal drinks, consume the alcoholic drinks, and get drunk. And they continue to do it over and over and over and over and over again because for them, the experience of being intoxicated is enjoyable. Now, these are monkeys that we're describing here. They'll do it over and over and over again, right? So there is an intense motivation that's internal that prompts someone or something to pursue something that brings enjoyment. That's just that's just the way it is. Cats, for example. If you have a cat, I'm allergic to cats, but I love cats. If you have a cat, you might have heard of something known as catnip. Now, catnip is something that cats enjoy. It's irresistible, but it is a naturally occurring substance that if a cat engages with it um, in nature, they show symptoms of intoxication, and the cat will continue to do it. Now, the catnip, which comes from, I believe, a flower, the flower itself is not something that the cat has to have, right? It's not like water or shelter or food or the desire to reproduce. It's not something like that. So why does the cat do it, right? The cat seems to do it because interaction with that flower brings enjoyment to the cat. And then the cat repeats that behavior to experience that enjoyment again. That seems to be the case. There's also cases of poisonous insects being bitten, and that the self-defense mechanism of that insect is to secrete toxins. Now, those toxins are poisonous, and that is important for the defense of that insect. And there are numerous recordings of animals nipping and biting the insect to induce the secretion of the toxins. Once that insect begins to secrete the toxins, the animal then licks off small amounts of the toxins that have been secreted, licks off small amounts. That animal then becomes intoxicated. And that animal does it over and over and over and over and over again to the point where it becomes part of the behavioral patterns of that particular animal. Why does the animal do that? Because I do believe that it is something intrinsic to many living things, including humans, to pursue anything that brings enjoyment, whether that's substances or behaviors, right? So going back to, the gambling disorder, um, as described by the DSM, it's a persistent and recurrent problematic gambling behavior leading to clinically significant impairment or distress is indicated by four or more of the following in a 12-month period. And here are the criteria: needs to gamble with increasing amounts of money to achieve excitement. Um, that is similar to tolerance. Is restless or irritable when attempting to cut down or stop gambling, similar to withdrawal. Has made repeated unsuccessful efforts to control or stop gambling, is preoccupied with gambling. That's the fourth. Five, often gambles when feeling distress. Number five. Six, after losing money, returns another day to get even, right? So you've lost more than you plan on losing, right? And so you've got to make up for it, right? Lies to conceal the extent of involvement, right? So you might be an individual who gambles every single day, but the fact that you gamble every single day, you're embarrassed about. And so you conceal or hide the fact that you gamble every single day, or you gamble as much as you do because you understand what you are doing to be socially unacceptable or unacceptable by the social circles that you find yourself in. But you do that so that one, you keep the appearance of being somebody who doesn't gamble as much as you actually do, while at the same time being able to gamble as much as you do. Uh, Now, the eight has jeopardized or lost significant relationships, jobs, or opportunities because of it. And number nine relies on others to provide money to relieve financial situations caused by gambling. That probably is related to losing friends because of gambling. But there you have right there. And obviously, there's severity, mild, moderate, severe. So mild is that you check off 4 or 5 of those boxes that I just mentioned, moderate, 6 or 7 of those boxes, or severe, 8 or 9 of those boxes, right? So I think one of the things to just really kind of step back is one, I think we have more of our neighbors, more members of our community that are grappling with um, disorders than we probably appreciate. That we ourselves might be grappling with a disorder that we don't know that we're grappling with because we don't necessarily understand ourselves, nor do we understand mental health. I just picked 2 small examples and we just scratched the surface of these situations. We decided to go with gambling a little bit because its visibility is increasing. And with it being one of the fastest growing industries, it also means that it can create a situation where more and more people are become people who struggle with a gambling disorder. But I also wanted to kind of describe gambling disorder in a context um, that shows how related it is to substance use disorder. And I attempted to pull all the definitions and all the descriptions straight from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual uh, for mental health disorders. So, what you heard here is the authoritative definition of the terms that I just described. But then we also wanted to explain how natural it actually is. And by appreciating the nature of a thing, we can better assist people who are struggling with it because we can better understand what they are up against. Most of the time, people who are struggling with addiction or gambling, they are simply pursuing something that brings them a great deal of satisfaction and enjoyment. Um, Nothing more and nothing less. So, looking at it from that lens, we can appreciate them not as sick people, not as people with something wrong with them, just as people, people who want to pursue enjoyment and fulfillment just like everyone else. But we now have an opportunity now as seeing individuals, as people no different than ourselves, to better assist, to better help, to better prevent, because we know a little bit more about it. So that's just really, really important. I want to transition to something else that's really important to this. Everything that we know about mental health and how we put together these guidelines and these standards for diagnostics, these standards for really understanding who someone is, it all comes from research. But what is research? Is it science? Is science research? Is research science? Can everybody do science? Can everybody do research? It's a very complicated thing. You've heard so many times that science is important, but you've also heard so many times, oh, this isn't science or this is science. Well, science is one of those words that I alluded to earlier that doesn't really have a good definition. And I don't care what anybody says. Someone who's listening to this can say, oh, no, I have completely clear in my head what science is and what science isn't. Oftentimes, it is communicated through a sense of pride and self entitlement. Oftentimes, people are creating a definition of science that includes the fields that they are a part of and excludes maybe fields that they don't care about. That's also really important to appreciate. So they don't have really good definitions. And so here today, I am going to define what science is. Okay. I'm not going to say what it isn't, that will be implied, but I'm going to define what science is. Now, I've had the honor and opportunity to write about this. And so I'm just going to provide you with some insights for you here. All right. So, science is the pursuit, acquisition, dissemination, and communication and application of novel knowledge. Pursuit, acquisition, I'm going to throw interpretation in there. Interpretation, dissemination and communication and application of novel knowledge. Novel simply means new. Now, it's important when we say new that we're not just talking new information to the individual. What I'm saying as new information, I'm saying previously unknown by all of humanity collectively. That is what I mean. I think that is the huge difference. Now, yeah, you can do research. Anybody can do research. All research is that you're finding something that you don't know, right? That's important, right? You've heard somebody say, do your research, right? Yeah. Do your research so you know something that before doing your research you did not know, right? But that should not be confused with scientific research. Scientific research results in new information that no one prior to that research knew. So collectively, all of humanity that has ever been, no one has found what you found. And you finding that now contributes to the body of knowledge of all of humanity is an entirely different thing. It's entirely different. It's entirely different. Now, I will also say that science isn't just the research, right? It isn't just the research, right? It is also the interpretation, right? It's also the dissemination of that knowledge, right? That novel, that new information, and it's the application of that new information. All of that taken together is science. All of it is part of science, right? And no piece is more important than another piece. All of it is critical to science, right? So all of it is science. So just one more time: pursuit, acquisition, interpretation, dissemination, application of novel knowledge. Novel knowledge. I just want to just make sure that that is crystal clear. It's novel knowledge, right? Something that no one has known before, right? Again, you can do research, right? And it's perfectly fine for you to go about learning something that you individually don't know. That is very important. But the difference with it going from research to scientific research is crossing over into the exploration of the unknown, that your pursuit and acquisition of knowledge grows the collective understanding of all of humanity, and that you have found something that no living person currently living or prior to you has ever found before. That is the huge difference between research and scientific research. That is the huge difference between science and everything else, is that we are pulling out something that is new, that is novel, that has never existed before. And then once we find it, we interpret it. So that's a key piece, right? So when we find something that's hard to understand, has anybody seen this before? So that's when you interpret it, right? That's when you work on dissemination and communication, because the dissemination and the communication is when you realize, wait, this is something that's new, or this is building on something that this researcher has done, or something that this research group has done, right? Or oh, we've already found that it's not novel, right? All of that is really important. In fact, uh, the pursuit by itself, it's hard to say if it's more important than the application. I mean, what good is the knowledge if you're not applying it? What good is the knowledge if you're not even communicating it? Right? So you need all of those pieces, and all of those pieces together are science. I'm going to define it one more time for the people in the back. Listen, and if you have a gripe or a complaint with the definition that I have provided, we can fight. I don't care. You have to define these things. And up until this point, I feel like the definitions have not been satisfactory or have been lacking in their entirety. And so I've put forth this definition for you to complain about, for you to argue with. Maybe you're arguing because you didn't come up with it, but whatever. Listen, science is this: the pursuit, acquisition, interpretation, dissemination, and application of novel knowledge. There you have it. There is science. If you have a confusion of what is or what isn't, look to there. If it falls outside of that, then it's not science. If it's in there, then it is science. But novel knowledge is key to that, right? It's key, it's key, it's key, it's key, it's key to that. And then somebody's like, well, what about science class? Well, science class is not science, right? It is important. It is important, but it's not necessarily science. It might fall within that dissemination of novel knowledge, but the reason why it doesn't fall into that, because it's not new, right? It doesn't add to that pursuit. It is important though, because it creates this foundation of understanding that individuals are able to build upon to find new things. But it's very different because science education, memorization, and regurgitation, the the activity of science is pursuing something new, right? It is the exploration of the unknown. So, two entirely different processes. But I think those things are really, really important. And also put together a piece regarding recommendations for science education. On the next episode, we'll go over all of that. It is absolutely exciting. I don't think there's too many things involved with education more important than science education. However, currently science education is looked at as an afterthought, especially when we're talking about K through 12 education, but that'll be a conversation for another time. Just recapping what we went over today, because it was a lot. We went over addiction. We dove into the diagnostic statistical manual for mental disorders. We talked about gambling. We talked about substance abuse. We gave the definitions as they appear in the DSM, and we just talked about how a better understanding of these things by all people will add to our better supporting individuals who are dealing with any of the things that we described. We also took a little bit of time to define science because it is so very and very important. Few things impact our lives more than science, and so things some very few things are as poorly appreciated and understood, such as science. And so I had that honor and privilege of talking to you about all of those things today. My name is, of course, Dr. Richard Watkins, your proud and humble host of the Richard Watkins Podcast. Again, the Richard Watkins Podcast is a proud production of the Science Policy Action Network, your go-to source for research, analysis, engagement, and consulting on a wide variety of issues. If you're curious on how to SPAN can work to support you, your company, your organization, look no further than www.span-inc.org. That is span-inc.org. Again, thank you so very much for being with us here on the Richard Watkins Podcast. And remember that the future is not something to wait for, it is something to build. And until next time, take care of yourselves.